I'll introduce Monika. Monika has been an iOS developer for over 8 years and currently works as a senior staff engineer at ChargePoint. She has worked for different kinds of teams, from being the sole iOS developer in a company of 10 to a group of 12 iOS developers. She enjoys taking an idea from rough inception to final production deployment. She still loves coding after so many years and is thankful about that.
Most days, yes.
Yeah. So yeah. All yours,
Okay,
Monika.
thank you. And I'll just share my yeah. So usually what we do is we kind of go over the particular chapter that we're looking at, and I usually read it and highlight it and just kind of go over the highlights. But this is supposed to be kind of like an interactive session. So as you're also looking at this, feel free to, ask questions or anything that you might have, learned from reading the chapter. Feel free to share that with the group. So the previous chapter, I think we started with, how do you use combine with networking calls? And Peter kind of on purpose sort of, sidestepped the whole error handling. So the example that he's been using all through this book has been this sign up form. And the network example that he showed was like, someone types in a username and we want to check on the server side if this username will be unique, available is the thing. And in his example, he didn't want to initially deal with the error part. So, when it's doing the publishing, we're basically saying, the result of the, query to the server is true or false. Is this username available or not? And then the other part is basically, is it fate, can it fail? And it says never. And the way it kind of deals with that if any point, it could have an error, for instance, the URL of the server is not valid, or it gets an error from the server, but it basically erases that error, just returns false, and for some things that might be okay, you just kind of, you may be in a certain communication that it doesn't matter whether the call failed or not, or there's like a local version of that, whatever you're trying to get from the server. But a lot of times, we do want to know if an error happened, and we do want to display that to the user because there's a, that operation failed. Like, we're uploading their photo and the upload failed, then obviously they need to know that there was this failure. So in chapter 10, we start kind of going over like, how do you deal with error handling and combine? And I have to say that it was kind of seemed like a lot in one chapter, and just the way we kind of process the error, it's a little gnarly. So I'm kind of assuming that once, I do some more examples, for me, it might become a little easier to understand all this. But anyhow, so, he talks initially about some strategies like ignoring the error, which is kind of what I mentioned. It's like, there are certain apps that if you can't connect to the server, they'll just kind of save the state locally. And then when it's, it can finally connect again, it just kind of, seamlessly updates and syncs up. And for that, you may not want to keep showing an error to the user. You just kind of maybe have a little, like, he was kind of mentioning like, you might have a little icon that shows, oh, it's still syncing, so that the user knows it did everything, whatever they were doing, did it finally finish or not. And then there is this other thing that there is an error, but you will keep retrying. So the first time that you get an error is not necessarily what we're going to display to the user. We're going to try, and there's different ways, like how many times you're going to retry before you kind of give up, and then show an error. And then, of course, there's the case where you show an error message. And for instance, you're trying to save a document and it failed. And then, and sometimes, like, there's like the whole thing like has failed, and you want to be very clear that the state of the client is not in a good state. And he kind of gave an example of, like, in Chrome, if the network is down and the device is offline, you will replace that entire view with like the little dinosaur, showing that you're going to play that game because you just can't do anything else. And then there's the example of the inline error message, which a lot of times we use this inline error messages for, like, actually his sign up form is a great example that your username sometimes, like, for that particular field there was an issue, like the characters are incorrect or whatever. Then you don't necessarily want to replace the whole view with just an error, but you may want to just kind of highlight that particular input field and explain why there was an error with whatever operation we were doing. In the example, this was actually, I thought, was a nice, so he does have the sign up screen, and he's basically showing, like, for Combine, how currently how are we, like, hooking up the Combine side to the sign up screen. So you have the sign up screen. There is a sign up screen view model, which we have been using. And, the last chapter, we kind of worked on this authentication service that basically connects to the backend server. So the sign up screen subscribes to that username that, is basically owned by the sign up screen view model. And the sign up screen view model is also subscribed to this publisher, which connects, accesses the authentication service to get, in this case, to verify if a username is available or not. And whenever, there's an update, then it kind of publishes that update to the sign up screen view model. And the sign up screen also has subscribed to these, to it, like, it is valid is one kind of a Boolean is for that particular, can it show the button? So there's a Boolean and sign up view model that, can change state depending on all the other validations that we're kind of doing. So this sort of like a flow of events, I think, is quite typical a lot of times of when we are, using, Combine publishers and subscribers. So I thought it was a good diagram. Any questions so far? I mean, we're just kind of going over. And then basically, previously, when we were doing this username available publisher, as he was showing, we kind of ate the error. So for instance, in here, if the URL is not valid format, then we just kind of return this false back, because the publisher is assumed to be returning a Boolean result and it never fails, and similar to here, like, here it's actually, and we discussed that, using combine, you kind of get basically the publishers that are now available for some of the common sort of networking calls. So like URL session actually has a data task publisher that you can basically use to get results. And again, as we know, when you're doing any kind of a networking call, there could be an error. And again, in this case, whatever error it gets, there is a special sort of operation where if there was an error, it just replaces it with a result. So that kind of was the state of how things work. And then he kind of discussed with, okay, so let's define an error. For in this case, it would be, we care about like, if like, the request is invalid and we want to return an error. So now you notice that any publisher is no longer bool never. It actually will return either a Boolean or an error. So in this case, instead of just eating that error, just returning false, we're actually returning an error in the case where the URL is not valid. And similar thing here. Well, here he's like, okay, well, what do we do with APIs? So because there could be different reasons why, like this one was easy. It was like the request is not valid and we're just passing the URL invalid. But here there could be different reasons why the actual network connection can fail. So he kind of comments out, well, we don't want to replace it with just false, but how do we deal with calling APIs and handling errors? And that's where things start getting interesting. Because let's go further into this. This is when there are other sort of things you can do when you have errors. So he starts with this example that, okay, we calling that operation, it can throw, it can have an error. In combine, there is a way to catch errors, kind of like how we do with do and catch in Swift, and just, whenever we're making a call in an operator, there's also like when you setting up the operator, you can also put a catchphrase. Now, this example kind of looks like, well, what's the point of catching the error and then just returning false? And then he's like, well, we're going to change that. I'm just kind of pointing out that there's a way we can get the error, and then maybe based on this error, we do different things. So then we go further down, and then he's kind of like, okay, so how do we make sure that, we receive, as a subscriber, we're receiving both failures and successes. And the other thing is, we also want to make sure that, here's the thing, like, we don't, if we say that the operator can fail, then anytime an error happens, like a failure happens, like we showed here, like there was like fail, where was it? Here. If we do like fail here, like the whole operation, it won't do anything else. It will just stop. And there's times when we don't want the pipeline to terminate just because we receive a failure. We want to go finish it up properly. So that's why, and then this was like, if I had Peter there, I would have asked, like, what's the, I kind of understand why we would need that, but it would be nice to get a little bit more explanation for this. But anyhow, so I think the thing is that we don't want to say that this operation fails, but at the same time, we do want to get the error back. So the way he kind of handles that is that now we have this result, which you've done networking in Swift, there's this result type, which we use all the time, like, especially if you're using Alamo Fire, is that, you can basically use this result type to encapsulate both an actual result and an error. It's kind of like a combination of the two. And then he shows how you can kind of like create a publisher that now can return this result that's an actual output of whatever, in this case Boolean, and a failure, but still have this never, which means it will never fail. It just could return an error, but it just because it reaches that error, it won't just stop. And he has written like an extension for the publisher. I think he was referring to John Sandel's work for this, where it just to make it so that if later we call it, it's already showing, we don't have to repeat this over and over. So if in the case that, we're getting, we're looking for the success or the result for the success. In case we get an error, then we just return this failed error. And then the result is either going to be like, it's either going to pass the information, or in that case, it's just on the failure side, it's either going to be success or failure as the what's going to be returned. So I might have like gone too fast on this. Just let me know. That's why I said like suddenly like this chapter, there's like there's a lot of so you notice here, like now that you have this like extension, you basically defining this publisher to be returning that type alias, the available, which was basically the bool error or never. And it's that thing here just made it so that it can return that kind of a result, that extension as result method. And then he goes through like giving some examples, which is nice of like, okay, like, so now it's returning these, returning an error. How do we, for different cases, how do we define these errors? So we already had like, going back to, and usually if you guys are using Swift, a lot of times you come up with your own categories of errors that make sense for your application. And in his case, he's kind of defined this API error, which is the kind of errors we're going to get when we're making these network calls. And one was that invalid request error where, the request itself, like the URL, is invalid. So that would be an error that we would want to return. And then based on that error, show something reasonable to the user. Another one is a transport error, like something as part of like, the network was down, or that particular server was, not running. So you kind of want to have a that specific type of error, which is kind of the transport error. So here, we go back to the same example. So, have our authentication service. We define this check username available publisher. And the first thing that it's doing is like, okay, here's the URL. And if it's not a valid URL, we're going to return a fail here. And it's okay to return a fail here because as we realize with this whole as result method that we do catch it and just return just return it as part of the result type. So it won't fail, it won't stop, like the pipeline will continue, but we're just returning that specific type of an error. And then if that's all good, and then we're actually going to, make a call to that URL. And this was kind of like, I'm assuming, and I didn't have time, we have to kind of take a look at, I think this map error is part of like the combined thing that, if you get an error, you could maybe change that error. So it's in a similar, it's kind of like publishing, kind of like with the other maps. This is specific to errors that we can get it and then return a specific kind of error, so in this case, like we know it's coming from the URL session. So this must be something that's with transport. So we're going to return it as a transport error. And then if it went through all this, then, we do have the data. Here, it is doing the JSON decoder. Now, it's possible, he hasn't shown that even trying to decode the data, you could run into error. At this point, we're not dealing with that. And it's actually interesting what will happen if that fails, actually. I should actually try an example. I didn't have time to see what happens there. So let's see. So did that, and he kind of uses the numbering to just kind of go over the different parts that he's oh yeah. And once, so this was our publisher that we defined here. Now, as a subscriber, what does this mean? So you get a result, right? And remember, your result is going to have a success and a failure, the way we define it. So if it's a failure, then there's an error associated with it. So that way we can get the error and then look for different types of the errors that we can have. And then we return different messages to the user. So if it's like a transport one, we may want to, we will just return an empty string for now, which is not show anything. Else, if it's not a transport, then we actually show the localized description. And the transport one is interesting too, because probably we don't want to just not show anything, but it might be like, for some cases we, in apps, we just do it kind of like, error, if, network error or something to let the user know. So it may not have to be an empty string, but we definitely are not using the localized description from there. And then if there's success, then basically, then we know it's, true or false. So then that kind of determines our username message, whether we're going to show that the username is not available or it's all fine. So we're not showing any message. And here, for the is valid, because remember that we were subscribing to this username available publisher for two things. One was for the message that we show in the form, and one was for that Boolean state that we keep of whether this form is valid or not. And in this case, he is, if it's a transport error, he's kind of saying it's still true because, yeah, the server may not be, we might not be able to connect to it, but it doesn't mean that the username is not available. Although I kind of had a little doubt about this, whether this was a good thing to do or not. But it's a question I have to ask him. But otherwise, if it's other errors, then we want to return false. And then if it's available, then it just returns whether it's available or not. And if it's true, of course, the form would be valid, otherwise no. Now, I think he, what was it? Did see what he discussed for one. Yeah, if that's the case, we return an empty string to suppress the error message. Yeah, final results. Yeah, it says keep in mind that ignoring the network error is a viable option for this kind of UI. It might be an entirely different story for your use case. And I think his argument is that, it could still be valid, and we just will, when the user finally submits, and if the networking is good. I guess he doesn't want to, necessarily stop the user from being able to submit just because there might have been a momentary network error. I kind of disagree with that because I'm like, somehow the user should know something's up. That it couldn't even get the validation, but I think that part it's kind of up to the caller. Any questions so far? I feel like I've just been talking a lot. Yeah, it's kind of yeah, I feel like this chapter, there's just a lot of information and different cases, so it feels kind of a lot, but I think one would kind of learn it more once you may just take this and try, applying it to something, your own app or a small sample app similar to what he has, just to play around with it. And actually, to be honest, I read this, but I didn't have time to play around too much. And I think that's what I'm going to do a little bit over the weekend. I just didn't have time. So it's kind of good to see, okay, because some of the stuff, it just, we're just kind of taking it, and there's new concepts, there's that map error that I wanted to see here. So this is kind of similar to what he was doing, but now he was kind of talking about, like, how do you sometimes there could be different, and I think I kind of touched upon this, that when we're actually getting a response, it may not be a valid format, and we were kind of not dealing with that in his previous example. So we, here we map, like if we get an error when we're calling, at this point where it's just getting, trying to connect to the server. If those kind of errors get thrown here, then we know they're transport errors. But in here, and then this is a whole new concept, there's like, now we do get a data and a response. But even here, we may not have a proper like HTTP URL response. It's very rare for this to happen. And he gives some examples, but if that's the case, then we do want to catch it and throw. And that's the other part. I didn't know that, in a publisher, you can use this try map and actually be able to throw an invalid response. And that still for the whoever's kind of subscribing to it, they'll still see it as part of that error result. So that's when I said, things get more complex. And then he's doing a bunch of like, of course, if it was using like Alamo Fire, you can already specify like, okay, these are the status codes that are valid. But here, like, if it's 200, between 200 and less than 300, we're good. So we don't do anything. Or if it's not between that, otherwise, we're gonna try to decode. Yeah, I got it wrong. So if it's between 200 and less than 300, we're good. We got the right status code. Otherwise, he's saying that it's possible that we actually have it. And this happens all the time for servers where it's a specific error coming from the server. So it wasn't a transport error. It was just that whatever operation you were doing, either you had, you were passing the wrong parameters or anything like that, or maybe there's an authentication issue. We're going to get a specific kind of an error message format from the server. And this is a way to basically sort of decode that error. And he's looking for a specific status code, although there'll be a bunch of them. So, okay, if it's 400, it's a validation error. But in reality, there will be a bunch. There could be a bunch of mappings here based on the different status codes. And then if all this is good, then you will be returning a data and a response, and then continuing on by trying to map the data and decoding. So as I said, suddenly this whole like processing of errors gets a little gnarlier based on all these different kinds of errors that we're trying to catch. Yeah. Let's see here. And then he's showing as a subscriber again, you're getting this result. If there's an error, then you're looking for these different cases. Is it a validation? Is it transport error? And then if it's success, here's what we do. Yeah, and here then he discusses that and that's where initially when I was seeing is like, well, even when we're like trying, like we're getting this response, we're assuming the response will be exactly in the format we're expecting it. But sometimes my experience has been there's times when we don't, like there is, maybe it's the wrong version or the server has a bug, who knows, that this JSON decoding actually fails. And then in that case, then that itself, like, you would be throwing yet another type of error that's kind of like a decoding error. So that, again, on the receiving side, you kind of know that it didn't succeed. And then here's like, by conforming API error to localized error and implementing the error description, we can provide a more, that's actually, aside from the whole combined stuff, this is really a good practice that when we're sort of defining those errors, that, we provide a good user facing error messages that we can display to the user. Although there are times like there's certain things that for transfer or whatever, that it would be nice to have a kind of a clean error message. For certain things, we do kind of want to show the exact error that we get, usually from the server. If it's a good API, it would be giving you an error code and maybe a localized message back. And in that case, we would be using the servers. But for these kind of things, like, if it's some kind of a validation or decoding, then we just want to kind of have something that's, user-friendly to map these errors to. And here he's sort of like was showing that, if like, there's some examples where you may also like not have the latest version. So, and you realize, oh, there's like, we're getting the wrong response back from the server, then we may want to show a dialogue and tell the user, go get the latest version. Although I'm kind of thinking, you probably don't want to wait till, usually with APIs, you have some versioning in the API itself, so that hopefully one doesn't have to like get into the state is like, oh, unless like somehow the server broke its, for the same version, they went and changed something on the server, which sometimes happens, but hopefully that's not the only way to catch these kind of issues where the data that you're expecting is not the data that the server, there's been an update in the server. So you either have to change your app. Most likely, you have to change your app to do it. And then the interesting thing with if you've done SwiftUI alerts is that this is presented is always based on another state of another property. So you put that code in the SwiftUI, and if this, whatever that property is, this state becomes true for that specific thing, then the alert shows up, which I always thought it was interesting, because a lot of times with the rest of like, when you're doing UI Kit, you're explicitly like displaying an alert, and this is kind of different from how we're used to doing it. Let's see. He's just showing now. So usually, as he makes these changes, then we're sort of kind of go back to the code where we're and then here he's just like, okay, now we have this show update dialog, which is yet another property of the view model. And this happens if, like, for instance, if this decoding error is happening, it's inferring that, maybe this client is, not in sync with the latest server. And that's why we're going to show the update value. Yeah, and then there's all these like internal server errors, things like he was giving, like a username with less than 4 characters will result in a too short validation. You get a 400 status. An empty username will result in an empty name error. So and this is what I was mentioning. Like initially, it was just, we were looking at just the 400 status code, but in reality, there are a bunch of different status, error codes that could be returned from the server. So once we're trying to decode that error message that we got from the server, then we're going to actually, we could be mapping them. Yeah, so in this case, we have a new server error that takes in a status code, a reason, and a potential retry after. So the retry after, the interesting things, I've actually haven't really used or worked with a server that enabled that. It's an interesting idea that as part of like making a network call, you could, let's say the server is down or something is going on. It might give you this hint of retrying after a certain time again. And then it would be nice to actually store that, so that then once we get that error, we can potentially then do another retry. And then here he's kind of showing that, okay, so before, if we had a validation, we showed the reason for what that validation error was. If it's a server error, then, if there is a, if the server error had its reason that we got from the server, then we want to show that. Otherwise, then we're just going to have some, default error message. We're just going to say server error. And then any other errors, then we're going to just show the localized description of that error. So, and here's yet another, so this is just combined, is just has so much stuff. So here in the data task publisher, so we saw a bunch of new things. There was like map error. So getting the error and returning a new error from that. There was try map, when you're trying to attempt to do some operation and then throwing an error if that operation didn't succeed, and that error gets goes down the pipeline. And then there's this whole thing called retry. So you can go and actually, if it's not successful, then it will retry that many times. Now, he also kind of mentioned this, that, any failed request, that, basically didn't, that, threw an error, then will be retried 3 times, because we put 3 here. And the issue with that is that, maybe only for certain errors we want to, retry. For other things, it doesn't make sense to retry. And the other thing is there's no pause between the retries. you can imagine that if the server's having some issue or it's being busy, you don't really want to keep going and hitting it right one after another. You want to have like a little time and then try again. And doing this kind of retry thing here doesn't allow for that. So he kind of brings up this question. We only retry, certain types of failures, which kind of makes sense. You probably want to. And is there going to be a pause between the retries, which most likely that's kind of what we want. So then he kind of goes back to that example that he was given. So, there is now, and yet there's another one. So we have like try map, and then you have try catch, where you get this error. And then depending on what the error is, so in this case, he's looking at if it's like a server error, then it's going to throw an error. So when we catch a server error, we want to wait for a short amount of time. Yeah, and he hasn't filled in this yet. So let's look what he's going to do with this. Yeah, so if it's a server error, and this is kind of like looks like a little trick thing where we're just returning just nothing. And then we delay for a certain amount of time. And then we just, we basically return our data task publisher again, which basically means that it's going to be, it's kind of like a way to like wait for a little bit and then return another, because remember, this is kind of like a pipeline, where we're just kind of getting events from this publisher. So we're waiting a little and returning another publisher that basically we're still subscribed to. And that will, again, go and make the network connection. And again, we would see if we get an error or not. And we're basically doing this like 10 times, which would not be like a regular, it would be less than that. But I think he put that number so you can see if you're running it. Oh, okay. Basically, when there's an error, this particular publisher just kind of sends that last, its event, and then there's a delay, and then basically we're returning another publisher which will redo the network connection. And again, this is a lot to wrap your head around. I'm not going to say that this was like totally made. I mean, it works. Something that definitely will work, but it is kind of really funky, in my opinion. I guess it's could be cool because it's definitely still less code than whatever you would have written to have a whole retry mechanism, but it's not easy to grasp right away, at least for me. And then he shows and then finally we get to the summary. Here's some strategies, yeah, and he says, in comparison to the original code, the code became a bit more complicated. And this is something we're going to address in the next chapter when we're looking at implementing your own combine operators. So we'll see how that next chapter is going to look. But to me, yeah, it definitely was a lot more to absorb and understand. And even though the chapter wasn't that long, I felt like, this could be a good example where you may want to really play with the code and run it and, change like some things just to see how it works. Because if you're just kind of reading the chapter without really trying to run the code and understand, I think it kind of goes over your head. At least it did with me. So anyhow, yeah, we have a quiet group today. But I would suggest, if you get a chance, read this chapter, play around with the code. I'm planning to do the exercise. Oh, actually, he didn't put exercise here. I thought there was exercise. No. So, but just run the code. And then next week, we're going to do chapter 11 and see if these custom combined operators, how do they work? Do they simplify anything or not? And I think that's always been my feeling, that combined is great, but it's also like has a lot of things in it, and it does take time to really understand and know how to use it. So, and that's kind of the whole point of doing this study group. But I really suggest, if you can, the code is in GitHub, and go through this chapter's code. Anything else we should discuss? Everyone's good? Yeah, I felt like, okay, it's always like this. It starts reasonably simple and then it gets way more complicated. Definitely. But that's why we learn. Anyhow, let me stop my share and I will stop recording.